All right, and we're live. So this is going to get recorded, and then we're going to make some editions. But anyway, my name is Ugo Stornaiolo Silva. I'm the international correspondent for España Navarra Confidencial, for which who don't know what it is, it's a Spanish newspaper. We're a pretty much a conservative publication. We like free markets, we like tradition. We're close to the Carlists, and yeah, that's who we are. In Latin America, in the rest of the world, we're trying to promote a fairly conservative view, and we try to find interesting people who share our values, who share our views, to talk with them, to interview them. And so today we have Mr. Charles Haywood, who is the maximum leader of the Worthy House, which is a kind of small publication in which Charles promotes some of the readings he likes. He tries to promote as well his own philosophy, which he calls foundationalism. Am I right?
You are correct.
And he's pretty much on the same page as some of other thinkers in the US who are promoting this doctrine called the post-liberalism, what comes after liberal democracy. And so, welcome, Charles. It's a pleasure to have you here.
I am very pleased to be here.
Right. So, well, we're talking a little bit earlier before about some schools and the way education is changing. So I would like to ask you my first question about that. What do you think happened with education, at least in the US, and well, by extension, in the rest of the world?
Sure. I'd really divide it into higher education, so say college and graduate school, and lower education. It's interesting because in the United States, at least lately, the latter, lower education, has been more in the news, whereas up until quite recently, when people complained about, say, political bias and what have you in a kind of one-sided viewpoint, they primarily meant higher education. So this has been a long-going thing, and you can trace various threads of it, but everybody knows that in the United States, higher education has been completely captured by the left. And that's true both in terms of the professoriate, whether that's the humanities or even into the sciences, but also into the administration. And the administration is something that has expanded hugely in the United States. Large parts of that administration in higher education are devoted to the sole purpose of advancing leftist political goals. So really, it's kind of a large-scale thing. The higher education in America is completely ruined and dominated by people who are very far left, who use the ecosystem for their own benefit. It's all intertwined, obviously, with the federal government, which has federalized essentially all higher education. And now, of course, with the dubious Biden administration this has gotten even worse. So this is a very big problem. It's a big problem for people like me who have children who will relatively soon enter the higher education arena. But that's certainly what's happened to American education. More recently, though, the left has essentially, in large areas of the country, taken over lower education as well, and used it as an indoctrination factory, beginning in kindergarten for everything from homosexual propaganda to economic propaganda to Greta Thunberg kind of global warming propaganda. You name it, it all kind of fits in. And surprisingly, this has happened in a lot of very conservative states. In America, lower education is run at the state level, though the federal government tries to interfere in it, but doesn't have as much power as it does at the upper levels of education. And so, quite surprisingly, because frankly, all the conservatives were asleep at the wheel, the left wing was able in many states, including mine, for example, which is Indiana, which is a conservative state, quite conservative state, generally speaking, to take over the public education and the private education establishments and push just the worst and most heinous kinds of propaganda. The good news is that people have realized this and have been very successfully pushing back against this, which is, I think, a surprise to some people. But it really is interesting to see how in most local areas, when parents get together and push back against this, they can be quite successful. So while I'm somewhat pessimistic typically about politics in the short term, though I'm optimistic in the long term, this is one area where I think conservatives are doing a really good job. And you can see the fear that has resulted. I mean, the terrorist attorney general, a guy named Merrick, has been using gangster threats against parents to treat them as terrorists for daring to push back against this. And this kind of overreaction shows how afraid they are. So that's kind of what I would say is the layout of education in the States.
Well, since you kind of, you try to promote some readings in your YouTube channel and your webpage, I would like to talk about some of them. And considering you were talking about the state of education in the US, I would like to ask you if you think this is the result of what Gramsci called the long march through institutions in his prison notebooks, I think.
I've never read the Prison Notebook, so I'm familiar with Gramsci and the concept. It's one of those things that I think I should read, but I'm pretty sure that the summary probably is adequate. I mean, that's absolutely the case. I think it's taken about 40, 50 years for the left to do this in the United States. And I think what's more interesting to me, because we kind of see obviously the fruits of what's happened, but what's more interesting to me is that it's very difficult for people who are on the right to defend against this, simply because people on the left tend to get their life meaning from participating in this kind of thing. That is, you can start off as a young person and say, I want to, in essence, dedicate my life to advancing my political views through manipulating the education system or some other political activity, but let's take the education system. And yes, you want to get paid a salary and so on, but you derive meaning, transcendence from doing this for decades. You see enormous amounts of left-wing people get their meaning from this. That's simply not true on the right wing. That is, most people on the right wing aren't as ideologically oriented. That is, they don't get their life meaning from politics at all. Maybe a little bit, but they're more interested in family or career or making money or something else. And they're certainly not interested in dedicating their life to political manipulation. That just doesn't give meaning to people on the right wing, simply because people on the right don't have an ideology in the same sense in most cases. Yeah, there are right-wing ideologies, but the fact is very few right-wing people are ideological in the sense that the left wing is, which is an all-consuming, all-explaining kind of political philosophy around which you rotate your life. So one of the things that I struggle with is that, let's say we defeat the left's various power centers, and the right is, however you define that, the post-liberal right comes to power in the United States or anywhere else, but let's take the United States because that's what I'm familiar with. It's not clear how you defend against people like this who are so ideologically oriented. And this has always been true for the left for, roughly since the French Revolution. How do you defend perpetually against a group of people whose all that matters to them is imposing their ideology on other people? I mean, I really have no idea. I guess you can make them go to their own country, or you can persuade them to adopt a new set of beliefs or something. But it's a very hard thing to struggle against. You can have tactical individual victories pretty easily because the right wing is more sensible, more reality-based, and so on. But it's hard to have a kind of overarching permanent victory. This is actually a very big political problem.
Oh, well, you're talking about a post-liberal right, which means that liberalism, at least, or either has been co-opted by the left, or if it still is right-wing, is not working. So what do you mean by post-liberal in that sense?
Well, post-liberal means different things to different people. So it has, of course, like a lot of catchphrases, the debility that it's too broad in some circumstances. But generally speaking, post-liberal means that the American liberal experiment has failed. That doesn't necessarily mean it was doomed to fail. I would say it was doomed to fail, most likely, in the sense that I reject the Enlightenment entirely. And since the American experiment is founded largely, but not entirely, upon Enlightenment principles, probably the only reason the American Revolution and America worked for 150 years was eating the seed corn of the virtue of a competent frontier people. And this was what we have now was bound to happen sooner or later. We see it all around the world, and all the people, all the countries that have adopted, generically speaking, liberalism. So when I say post-liberal, I mean rejecting the values of the Enlightenment. And when I mean the values of the Enlightenment, I mean a focus on emancipation as the prime political goal, the release of people from unchosen bonds and turning them into atomized people adrift on a sea of choice, and forced egalitarianism, the idea that everybody must be forced to be equal. And emancipation and forced egalitarianism are, in my view, the two key Enlightenment beliefs. A lot of people will say that's silly because the people who push Enlightenment beliefs like to take credit for all sorts of things that have nothing whatsoever to do with Enlightenment, like the rule of with the Enlightenment, like the rule of law, or scientific advancement, or freedom of speech. All those things have nothing whatsoever to do with Enlightenment. That's just a propagandistic attempt to take from earlier Enlightenment philosophers to take credit for things that were developed by Western philosophers long before anyone ever heard of the Enlightenment.
Well, in your website, I've been trying to catch up with some of the videos. Well, they're kind of reviews of books you're posting, and so I've seen that you kind of like the figure of Carl Schmitt. I say this because I'm writing about Carl Schmitt right now for my undergrad thesis, and so whenever everyone kind of promotes his ideals, he gets quickly attacked as, no, you're promoting a philosopher, a jurist who was associated with the German National Socialists. And I think that maybe Carl Schmitt is becoming somewhat of a central figure for this new post-liberal right.
I'm not sure that Carl Schmitt is a central figure for the post-liberal right. I think he is for some elements of the post-liberal right, but at least in the United States, Carl Schmitt has been a figure of interest for both the left and the right for a good 30 years. I don't know whether this is true outside of the United States. For example, it may be the case that in Germany, you're still not allowed to talk about Carl Schmitt. It's obviously kind of a facile thing to say that Carl Schmitt was associated with National Socialism. I mean, yes, he was associated with National Socialism because he was in some ways an ambitious opportunist who jumped on board the Nazi bandwagon for a couple of years before he got kicked off the Nazi bandwagon. But I mean, that's really kind of incidental to his larger political thought. And I won't claim to give a 10-word summary of Carl Schmitt because there's a lot more to it. I'm currently, as you probably know, reading my way and reviewing my way through chronologically through all of Carl Schmitt's works. But I think Carl Schmitt is the apostle of political realism rather than ideological politics. And ideological politics is what has driven the West for a good 150 years, longer in some areas. And Carl Schmitt is someone who recognizes how politics works in real life because of how human nature is, and therefore rejects certain elements of what is generically called political modernity, including liberalism, including the idea that, for example, that parliamentary democracy is inherently the best system, and a wide variety of other things. So I can't summarize Carl Schmitt in a nutshell, nor will I try, but he's somebody who reading about his thoughts helps one understand the current moment, because it helps remove from your eyes the propaganda and the blinders and the extra layers of stupidity that have been applied over most political thought in the West for quite a long time.
Well, since we're talking about the political realism, you might be familiar with the work of, with the larger work and corpus of theory of elite theory. And I've seen you read some books by James Burnham. So I think that we can apply that doctrine to the current events and see what's happening with the elites in the United States, what's happening with the elites in the imperial provinces of the United States, so to speaking, in Latin America, in Western Europe.
Yeah, I've read a fair bit of Burnham, and of course, there's people who are kind of tied to some of what Burnham said, like Peter Turchin, who wrote Ages of Discord, which talks a lot about elite theory in the sense of elite overproduction and some other things that are more applied principles rather than the political theory. Yeah, I think that obviously what Burnham has to say is in some ways a truism. That is, every society has an elite. That elite runs things. That elite tends to not admit that it runs things, and what have you. I think Burnham is a little bit too cynical in the sense that he's part of this group of people who are a bunch of atheists who think that everything that people do is strictly a result of narrow self-interest. I think there's more room for transcendent beliefs and beliefs acting contrary to individual interests but for the benefit of society. Nonetheless, the elites matter. And my objection isn't that we have elites. My objection is that we have terrible elites. And I think all of our elites should be thrown out the window. That's true, not just for the United States. It's true also for every other Western country that I can think of. It may even be true for Hungary and Eastern Europe. I'm half Hungarian, as I've said before, and so I know a fair bit about it. Generally speaking, I'm a big fan of Viktor Orban, though he's adopted a kind of the usual Western chicken little crazy attitude towards the Wuhan plague. So I don't know what's up with that. But our elites are just terrible elites. And that's just the nature of it. I kind of sympathize with the problem of being an imperial province of the United States. But my opinion is that this is all going to come to an end pretty soon, because you can, as they say, if something can't go on forever, it won't. So hopefully you will be released to go your own way from the American grip sooner rather than later.
Well, since you've talked about Orban, well, I can make a reference to the populist backlash that is happening all around the world, especially in Western countries. You had Orban in Hungary, you had Duda in Poland, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the United States, even if you're willing to consider him as part of this trend. Well, we're seeing that this populist backlash is not working in the long term. We can have like 4 years of peace, so to speak, and then it's the left again in power.
Yeah, but that's not going to go on forever. I mean, the left, you get the left is all in the United States, at least, which matters a lot for these purposes. Obviously, the left is very rapidly reaching diminishing returns. Basically, half the country, at least, pays no attention to what the regime media has to say, or more precisely, assumes that the regime media is lying to them. And that's because they are lying to them. I mean, for example, recently we had a Black Lives Matter activist massacre several white people because they were white in Wisconsin, and the media just pretends it didn't happen and it wasn't because this guy hated white people and so on. But everybody knows the truth. And when people are lied to, they become upset. And of course, they know they're not allowed to talk about it. And I mean, I can talk about it, but that's because I don't have a job. I can do whatever I want. But most people know they're not allowed to talk about it. They have to pretend that there's no such thing as anti-white hatred and so on. But the fact is that large sections of the left are driven by anti-white hatred. And I don't really like racializing things, but eventually this is going to cause big problems in the United States. So it may not seem like the left is back in power, but that's mostly an illusion. They've kind of, as I say, they're getting diminishing returns, and their reach is kind of as far as it's gotten. And the nature of a regime like this is that it's extremely fragile. Right now, the regime doesn't face any significant challenges. It has some on the horizon. I mean, inflation's going up, the supply chain's not good, but your average person's life feels pretty good. Yeah, they're tired of being lied to, and yeah, they're tired of being told what they can say, and yeah, but what does it really matter? They have food on the table. The heat's on, the furnace is on in the winter, but eventually this is not going to be the case, and the regime will immediately crumble, because that's what happens. I mean, that's my optimistic take, that the first crisis that comes along, whatever, and the nature of history shows us that crises are guaranteed to come. I mean, there's no universe in which the regime doesn't face real crises in the near future. The regime will just crumble immediately. I mean, it won't crumble peacefully. I'm sure there'll be all sorts of unpleasant activities, but I think people should be optimistic about the future, simply because it's not going to go on for much longer.
Right. Since in this answer you actually talked about three different things, I'm going to ask you in order. First, I'm going to ask you. You're pretty free to speak your mind and to promote your ideas and so on. And you come from a kind of elite school. Back then, you told me that you studied in the University of Chicago. You are a lawyer. You still are a lawyer.
No, I'm a recovering lawyer. That was 20 years ago. I am not a lawyer anymore, just for the record.
You're not practicing law anyway.
No.
Yeah, but still, you kind of try to be part of that elite group. And then right now you're not, and you're actually actively fighting against them, at least in the intellectual realm. So what happened there? How do you get free from their grip?
An excellent question. So I like money. Money is my favorite thing, other than my family. I mean, I like my family better than money if I had to pick, but I like money. I've always liked money. When I was like 3 years old, I wanted more money. I can distinctly remember it. So being a lawyer was fine. I mean, I was a large law firm lawyer in Chicago for several years. And back then, you made a lot of money, and you still make a lot of money as a large law firm lawyer, but it wasn't enough money, not nearly enough money. I wanted more money. And so I quit that to start a business. And then ultimately I sold the business. And so that gave me the ability to become a regime enemy and class traitor. That is, if I was still working for a big law firm, I would have to keep my mouth shut, because I would be instantly fired if I said 1/100th of the things that I say on my blog. I mean, the amount of oppression, tyranny, censorship that goes on in large law firms is extremely bad. And if I ever come to power, the first thing I'm going to do is destroy all large law firms. Well, I don't know. There's a lot of first things I have to do. Maybe I'll make the top 10. But I mean, large law firms in America are pernicious hellholes that are unbelievably societally corrosive and only exist as a result of the various forms of social disease, whether that's regulation or excessive litigation or what have you. Large law firms, we should have maybe 1/100th of the amount of lawyers we have in America, and the rest of them should be barred from ever even thinking about law again. The end. But I, of course, got out ahead of that, so lucky me. So that's how I became a regime enemy. I went out and made my own money, and so now I sit on top of my giant pile of money and do what I want, and wait for the next big thing.
Well, because at least for me, which I'm still very young compared to you and compared to many others in the right, well, it's kind of difficult because people like me, we want to speak our minds out. We want to promote certain ideas. We want to promote tradition, to promote freedom, and so on. And actually, I am thinking that we're losing some kind of institutional opportunities because we're not aligned with the regime. So it's kind
Absolutely.
of a paradox.
It's a huge problem. I mean, that is, it's funny. I'm currently writing a piece, though I haven't really done much on it yet, at the request of one of my readers. What should young people do? That is, this is one of the main questions, which is that if you're a young person, in order to, I mean, it's all very fine that Haywood says that things are going to be different in the future, but you can't eat promises. And so the young people have to do something. So to take just one example, if you I don't recommend that anybody go into law, not so much, yes, for the reasons I already mentioned, but also simply because the profession it lacks security. It's difficult in many ways. It's hard to get a high-paying job, harder than it used to be, and so on. But you have to get a job of some kind. My personal belief is that I'm a big fan of entrepreneurship, because as an entrepreneur, you can both have the possibility for making a lot of money, and you can at least, you may not be able to shoot your mouth off, but at least you don't have to toe the line in the same way you would working for a big corporation or a law firm or something like that. But entrepreneurship isn't for everybody. I mean, entrepreneurship, and there's no guaranteed success in entrepreneurship either. I mean, there's only a relatively small minority of people have the psychological makeup that makes them likely to be successful entrepreneurs. I mean, they may be very smart, they may have all sorts of great personality characteristics, but it's a specialized thing. So I haven't really worked out what a young person should do. My guess is, for example, I have a son who's interested in computers. That's a pretty, you can get a good job doing computer work of whatever type it may be, and kind of stay out of politics. But there really isn't a great alternative for young people. What I don't recommend to young people is that they go into post-liberal politics, say. I mean, that's just a waste of time. I mean, I think there's plenty of people who, if you spend your time on Twitter, which I tried to stay off Twitter, but Twitter exists, and you think there's all these people out there who are doing important work, and there's a few people who are doing some interesting stuff and what have you. But at the end of the day, these things don't really matter. You need to have a job, you need to have a family, you need to have as many children as possible, and need to be prepared for whatever the next turn of the political wheel is. Sitting around working in post-liberal politics probably isn't going to be a useful thing to spend your time on as a young person.
Well, since you talked about entrepreneurship, well, there's another issue about that, and that's economics. Now, not everyone has the same economic institutions that, for example, you have in the US, and that comes to a single concept: free markets. Well, maybe you are in favor of them, maybe you're not. I, for example, and the people at the newspaper I work with, we're all pretty much free marketers, but there are problems with free markets. There's ruled by corporations, there's a lot of inequality, and so on and so forth. So I would like to ask you about your own economic beliefs. Since you're an entrepreneur, I think you're pretty much for free markets.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I'm for free markets. We certainly don't have free markets now in many areas of the economy, whether that's as a result of government regulation that's mostly rent-seeking, that is, benefits one group of political actors at the expense of another, or simply because of monopolies and so on. So we certainly don't have any kind of free market system in the United States in any meaningful way. So I'm certainly a big believer in markets, free markets, as the optimal, generally speaking, the optimal economic structure. I do think there's plenty of role for government regulation in certain areas. That is, for example, if I was a government, I'd simply ban pornography. And because I don't think there should be a market in pornography, the end. But that doesn't mean that most areas of the economy should be more or less free, with some amount of government interaction or intervention designed to increase the overall social good. What we have now is the worst of all worlds, which is we have unfree markets with the intervention being designed for social bads. So we just need to get away from that. And you solve a lot of it simply by shrinking the government. The federal government should be 95% smaller than it is now. It should be a government of unlimited means and extremely limited ends. The federal government should basically have nothing to say about the vast majority of things. That doesn't mean it's a night watchman state in the sense it does nothing at all. It may well, for example, ban pornography, my favorite example, on a nationwide basis rather than leave it up to the states. Or may take other actions that are designed to improve the morals of the country as a whole. But generally speaking, free markets are going to be a lot better than any other alternative, especially some centralized attempt to control the markets. That said, I have no opinion, for example, on whether we should have a gold standard or whether Bitcoin is awesome. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Bitcoin is awesome. Who knows? I don't know. I mean, some people I respect are big fans of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and that sounds interesting. But I don't think that the gold standard or crypto or anything like that is going to solve all of our problems. Those things are all merely part of the overall package of good governance that we need to discover together after we get rid of our current ruling classes.
Well, since you talked about rent seeking, and we talked a little bit earlier about the state of the elites, I should ask you about some aspects, some cultural aspects of what a post-liberal society could look like, because we're seeing that we're in a godless society with elites that are rent seeking. They're only looking for their interests, and that people are. They do not have a moral compass to try to guide them in their lives. And so, I've seen a lot of alternatives, and we're seeing that there's a growing support for Catholics, for the Orthodox Church, even for the Protestant churches in America. Well, in the South, in Latin America, for example, we're not seeing that as much, but that's because we're somewhat delayed. And in Hungary, we're seeing a lot of support for the church. Orban himself, I think he's a Calvinist or something.
It's Calvinist, yeah.
Yeah, in Poland as well, there's a lot of demonstrations by Christian people. In France, we have Zemmour, we have Le Pen, who are, they're not religious, but they do understand the role religion has in politics. And so, what do you think is the role for religion in a post-liberal society, and for elites?
Yeah, religion is essential. I mean, everybody's known this. Anybody who's paying attention has known this throughout history, that you can't run a decent society without a strong core religious set of beliefs. It doesn't guarantee you'll have a good society. You can certainly run a bad society when you have a strong core of religious beliefs. But certainly from a Western perspective, Western historical perspective, Christianity is the thing that has always bound together the West and assisted the West in moving forward in optimal ways. And this is tied up with a couple of political things, notably the grossly inadequate amount of children people are having. That is, low religiosity is strongly correlated with not having any children or not having enough children. So I think whatever else may happen with a post-liberal organization, a return to a strong set of religious beliefs held in common by the elites and by the masses is strictly necessary for any decent future society. That is to say, if we wake up tomorrow morning and all of the elites that I hate so much have moved to the moon, and they've decided they don't like us anymore, and they're going to live on the moon, and then in their big moon colony, and we're left to do what we want. It doesn't help us. That's not adequate, because the fact is that the morals of society as a whole are entirely corrupted. And a large part of that is lack of religiosity, or what I would call fake religiosity. That is, in America at least, it seems that people are religious, but a lot of them believe in what's called moralistic therapeutic deism, which is the generic term for, well, yeah, I believe in God and God wants me to be happy and, have some money and, it's going to be great. I mean, that's not a real religion. It's just fake religion. So until the people return to the way of religiosity, you're never going to have a decent society that has any chance of accomplishing anything worthwhile. And it sounds kind of silly, but you can't really wave your magic wand and declare that everyone's going to be religious. But history shows repeatedly that returns to religion are inherent in human belief. I mean, it could be the Mormons. I mean, the Mormons are obviously growing very rapidly. It could be anything. I have my own opinions about what it should be, but I'm not in charge, unfortunately. So it's going to be what it's going to be. I think that the chances of having a religious revival as part of this renewal, well, I think it's required to have the renewal, but I think the chances of having a religious revival are actually extremely high. And I would expect that to show up basically at the same time that the elite structures collapse as the result of some kind of crisis. I mean, I don't like the idea of a crisis, which I guess is most likely to be an economic crisis, but could be anything, could be aliens. What do I know? I think people will return to being religious because that's just what people tend to do. And I think that's beneficial.
But I think that we're actually observing a religious revival in the US, at least in a very informal and heterodox sense, with the wokeism and all of the racial things in the left and the kind of faith they have in certain ideas and so on and so forth. And some authors have said that this is a direct consequence of the Protestant Reformation, 500 years later, something like that. So in a sense, we're seeing this kind of religious revival, but we're not seeing it in our side.
I do not think that wokeism is a religion. That is, I think a religion, the left is an ideology that a lot of people adopt because they want meaning, transcendence in their life. But that's not the same thing as saying it's a religion. It's a poor substitute for a religion. I mean, everybody, it's a commonplace, for example, that communism in its early incarnations was a religion simply because of the degree of devotion that its believers had and how they were willing to sacrifice things personally in order to move ahead the ideological goals. I think that's much less true for wokeism. I think wokeism is in part a attempt at transcendence, but I think much more it's a grift. And this relates to grift, meaning a fraud designed to give people stuff. This relates to Peter Turchin's theory of elite overproduction. That is, the vast majority of people who are pushing woke doctrines, whether that's running around rioting or pushing themselves forward in corporations and so on, are incompetent people who know that other people deserve money, honors, prestige, and so on more than they do. Because they are uneducated, stupid, and just generally worthless human beings. But they still want all the free money, they want the honors, they want the prestige, and so they adopt this pseudo-religion in order to demand that they be handed things. I mean, there's a range of people. There's probably some people who believe it so much that it's a type of religion, but that's not a religious revival. A religious revival has to involve a otherworldly transcendence, a belief in an actual God who says you should do this or you should do that. Wokeism is not that. Wokeism is basically just a giant grift by stupid people.
Well, this kind of relates to Donoso Cortés' theory of Christianity in one side and whatever the left, let's call it communism, progressivism, wokeism, anything on the other side. And in the center, you have a liberalism, which is kind of a mediocre combination of both. And so in here, I want to ask you, and this is going to be a reference to Patrick Deneen's book, why do you think liberalism failed?
Well, you can read Deneen's book, but I mean, I would actually recommend two books: Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, and also Ryszard Legutko's book, The Demon in Democracy. which is also goes in, which is actually, I think, is a short book and is, I think, probably the best book, even better than Deneen's discussion of how the left operates today and what drives the left. But liberalism failed because it contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction, primarily a denial of reality. And that is, back to my point earlier, if it's true that liberalism or the left focus on emancipation and egalitarianism, emancipation of people, the nature of human beings is that they should be embedded in a web of unchosen bonds. And when you release everybody from those bonds and you make everybody's interaction with every other person a matter of free, continuous choice, that flies in the face of human reality and will necessarily result in societal disaster. And in the same way, when you try to pretend that everyone is equal, whether that's equal in talents, equal in prestige, whatever, when you pretend that everyone is equal, that's always going to end in societal disaster. So liberalism failed because its two core principles were stupid. And here we are.
Well, actually, I think that I relate a lot to what you're saying, because I'm kind of close to people in the governing party in my country, which is actually a classical liberal party. And these guys, they only talk about GDP and economics and things that people don't really care. We're having a national security crisis right now. We're having problems in prisons. We're having a lot of drug-related violence and so on and so forth. And these people, they're pretty much clueless about what to do.
Yeah, I mean, there was last week it came out, or maybe it was earlier this week. Last year, 100,000 people, last year alone, died in America from illegal drug overdoses. And nobody cares. And the reason that they don't care is because most of those people are white people, and they're poor white people who are the trash of America, and our ruling classes hate them. And so, but 100,000 people is a lot of dead people. And I mean, you probably have something similar, though maybe I've read a few news articles. There's a lot of crime and violence, obviously relating around the drug trade as well. But the that's exactly right. The GDP as a substitute for human happiness is stupid. Plus, it's fake. I mean, I'm convinced that most of what goes into GDP is largely fake. That is, people doing fake jobs that are not really adding any value. But average GDP going up is just a pathetic way to measure a society's success.
Well, that's pretty much true, because we cannot simply say, oh, the economy is doing great, so everyone's doing great. That's not reality. You cannot say people are doing great if they're starving in the streets or if they're having a lot of social problems. But yeah, the economy is doing great because one or two corporations are doing great and they're producing a lot of wealth, so to speak. I mean, they produce wealth for banks and they produce wealth in their accounts, but they're not producing any material or real wealth for the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you go to California, I haven't been to California in a couple of years, fortunately for me, but this is very evident in California, where you have these, I mean, California is a beautiful state with unbelievable natural resources. And now what you have is a tiny slice of society run for the super rich and enormous amounts of poor people, broken down people, drug addicts, homeless people. You have this insane two-tier society that the upper classes, the ruling elites, pretend is great. I mean, it's just obviously not great. I mean, only an idiot would think this society was great, but somehow they've convinced themselves that this is a great society. For example, Nancy Pelosi, who's the odious Speaker of the House here, has just been revealed to have bought herself a $25 million house in Florida so she can get out of California, because she's ruined California and now she wants to move to Florida, where she can, hopefully people will walk by and yell at her or something. But these are just bad people.
Well, we have been talking a lot about the elites and how bad they are, but there's another side to it, and there's the rest of the people who are poor, the people who are jobless, the people who don't know what to do with their lives. And you see that populists in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America, they are trying to gain the trust of this kind of people in order to overthrow the elites. Actually, I think I wrote an article a while ago about the circulation of the elites and the role populism has in that. Do you think that this is a fairly recent phenomenon, or there's some kind of history behind it?
Well, there's always history behind populism, but its modern incarnation is very new, and I think that. So you mentioned Trump earlier. I mean, Trump, of course, had his good parts, had his bad parts, was terribly undisciplined, and so on. But Trumpism, the term generically used for the harnessing of populist energy, that's definitely a real thing. The problem you have is that it's not like the masses in America are some great repository of virtue. The masses in America have enormous problems. They have drug problems. There's heavy unemployment. They spend their time, as they say, in the pod, eating the bugs, watching the porn, watching Netflix, wasting their time on computer games. Something like, I think, 35% of job age men in America are not in the labor force, not looking for work. That's unemployed. That's totally different. Just simply not there. And that's not a virtuous way to live. I mean, it's tremendously corrosive way to live. And yes, it's true that a good politician can come along and get these people to vote for him, but it's not problem free. And by that, I'm not concerned with the things that our current elites are concerned with. That somehow these people will vote for someone who's unhealthy or racist or whatever the claims were about Trump. I just don't think that a populist-driven society is going, especially one with a unvirtuous populace, is going to result in. I mean, yeah, maybe it's better than what we have now, but the fact is that people here are dependents. They lack the older virtues that made America great. And so without having you need to have a new elite that, for lack of a better term, re-educates the masses in order to adopt new attitudes and take the country in new directions. Just having a politician who weaponizes the masses, well, it's certainly interesting. I mean, it's mostly interesting in kind of the bad way, like riots and fighting and civil wars and what have you. In order to renew the country, you need a new elite that helps remake the masses, not takes dictation from the masses about how they want, more stuff. That's just not going to work out. So populism by itself is interesting, but is not going to lead us to where we need to go.
Yeah, well, and that's actually what you said in your essay about an American Caesar. And yeah, I kind of agree with that, because we cannot put all of our faith in some kind of political messiah when we're having a deep structural and institutional problem with our own elites. Not everyone can rule, but the ones who can rule, or at least are credentialized to rule, they're doing it poorly and badly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why I kind of tend towards catastrophist solutions, which is that there's no clear way from here to a decent society. So at some point, we're just gonna have to shake everything up and see what comes out the other side. The problem, of course, is that what can come out the other side may not be better. You don't automatically get a better society when you shake everything up. On the other hand, we're rapidly approaching the point where it can't be a worse society. So, at some point it makes sense to roll the dice. And of course, you can't dictate that. I mean, it has to be dictated by outside events. This is Lenin always thought that he could rebuild Russian society. But of course, Lenin did rebuild Russian society, but that's only because the society had collapsed due to nothing that Lenin had anything to do with. So, yes, it's true that people can take advantage of situations, but historical trends are not susceptible to people directing them, only to taking advantage of them.
Well, let's see that there's some kind of catastrophe, not only in the US, but in all of the Western world. I think an economic crisis so big, so destructive that it affects the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and all of the central banks in the rest of Latin America, so to speak, in Australia as well, because we're going to include it in the Western world. All right, let's see, there's that kind of catastrophe. What comes after the catastrophe? How do you rebuild society?
Well, it depends on exactly what happens. I think that the biggest single problem is you have to discredit the current elites and replace them with new people. What you don't want is you don't want to have a kind of Russian post-communist thing, or more generally the post-communist Eastern Europe thing, where the same people who were responsible in the past rebrand themselves and are still in charge. They're like, oh yeah, we didn't, I'm sorry about the economic collapse, but this is the new way we're going to run things, and we're still the same people in charge. So you fundamentally have to have a new set of people take over. And that doesn't mean you have to fire everybody, but let's take the American federal bureaucracy. 90% of the people who currently work for the federal government should never, ever have anything whatsoever to do with working for the federal government again. Maybe 10% you still need to retain in order to make the government run, but you just need to get rid of everybody who, or the vast majority of people, everybody at the top, and then most of the people in the bureaucracy. You have to have some level of bureaucracy in order to run a government. But I think, to answer your question directly, I don't know, because the only system that works well is an organic system. And so if you have an economic crash where everybody is poorer, but most people are still alive, that's one thing. If you have an economic crash where 20% of the population kills each other in the streets, well, then you have a different kind of problem, right? I mean, it's a different kind of thing to rebuild if you've had a war than if you haven't had a war. If you have had a war, you have certain positive and negative aspects that make it both harder and more easy to rebuild a new type of society. Let's say that the COVID had been a real pandemic and had killed 10% of the people, as opposed to the trivial amount of old people that it did. I have the vid right now. Ooh, I'm gonna die. And so my whole family has the vid. Whatever. But if we ever get a real pandemic, then whatever the society is going to look like on the other end is very hard to predict, simply because there's so many variables. But at least to provide an opportunity to do something that's different.
Yeah, well, the thing about the organic society is that it's something that is not really talked about, studied in political schools or in law schools or, anywhere. I've learned about organicism and organic society and organic politics by studying by my own. I had some friends who told me about it, and then I tried to catch up and to understand what they meant. There's not something that they're actually saying to you in law school or in grad school for politics. This is kind of a very esoteric knowledge.
Yeah, that goes back to your earlier questions about the education system. That is, you have to have, in order to have a new, better elite, you have to have new, better education, whether that's autodidacticism, self-teaching, like you're talking about, or in America, for example, homeschooling is huge. It was getting bigger before the so-called pandemic, and now 10 million children are homeschooled, 15 million. It's an enormous amount. And even when they're not homeschooled, various forms of classical Christian academies and things like that offer a traditional education are exploding. So ironically, though it's largely invisible, there are a tremendous amount of young people out there now who are getting educated in a proper fashion. So maybe we'll all wake up in 10 years and these kids who are 8 years old now or 15 years old now will all rise up and be super well educated in kind of the traditional way and help establish the new society. The other problem, though, is back to your Gramsci point, is that unless the current ideological system is discredited, it's likely to creep back. And this is a problem I struggle with because I don't have a solution. The leftist project is very seductive because it promises it's like the apple in the garden. It promises all sorts of things to people that they allegedly can get for free that are wonderful. And that's a very attractive vision. So even if you establish a new society that's competent and virtuous and so on, these poisons are likely to creep back in. And so I don't know how you can permanently discredit these ideas without a existential collapse first, such that everybody blames the left for that. But it's not clear to me even that would do it, simply because what the left sells is so seductive, even though it's a pack of lies.
Well, there's an anecdote about this guy Otto von Habsburg, who was the son
Sure.
of the last emperor of Austria and Hungary. And this guy, he was homeschooled by his mother, the late empress. He became a diplomat by his own personal virtue and prestige, because he was a crown prince. And he organized a resistance to the Nazis in Austria. He organized the pan-European movement. He became a member of the European Parliament. So this kind of guy should be an example for all of the people who are trying to take back the institutions and so on. I mean, not all of us are noblemen who come from a long line of Christian aristocrats who ruled Europe, but yeah, we can try to inspire ourselves from the figure of Otto von Habsburg.
I think that's actually an excellent point, and I'm quite familiar with the Habsburgs, with my Hungarian connection. Obviously, the Hungarians are big fans of the Habsburgs, but I think that's an excellent example because a new ruling class or elite is likely to coalesce around an individual. The classic example, of course, is Napoleon, and famously Napoleon, who had his pluses and minuses, certainly, and was not necessarily a nice guy, but famously the French elites reformed around Napoleon, many of them adopting political positions diametrically opposed to what they previously had. They simply readjusted their political beliefs and moved on. And they honestly readjusted them, I think. I mean, some of it, of course, was opportunism, because that's human nature. But I think the right person, who most definitely is not someone like Donald Trump, but the right person in the right circumstances can have a catalytic effect upon a reformation and the rebuilding of a new ruling elite. It just has to be the right person who has not showed up yet. And I mean, in America, at least, we have the various people like Ron DeSantis and so on, but these people are all lawyers. Look, I'm a recovering lawyer and I like lawyers fine, but lawyers are self-selected for personality characteristics that don't fit well for being the man of destiny. You need someone like a Napoleon figure who has unique personality characteristics and is willing to take chances to the degree that most lawyers aren't. But someday we'll likely wake up and this person will have showed up. So we'll see.
Yeah, I agree. We people who study have studied law, we have our own lawyer biases.
Right.
We're not that trustworthy as we should be, and I think that's because we're trained to be opportunistic and to be a little bit treacherous.
Well, that's kind of a negative view of lawyers.
I know, I'm studying law,
but I think that it's also that lawyers tend to spend a lot of time weighing risk, and I think that if you're going to be the man of destiny, you simply can't spend your time thinking a lot about risks. You simply need to take action. And too much thinking and not enough doing is something that lawyers tend to fall into.
Right. So, for the case of the United States, there's a need for this kind of particular leadership that will purify the elites around him and will try to renew them and then you will have also, I think that as a parallel process, you will have a religious revival. Do you think this is a process very specific for the United States, or do you think this can be replicated anywhere else? For example, let's take Spain or Hungary or any country in Latin America.
Well, unfortunately, I speak not a word of Spanish, but and so I can't claim to have cultural insight. But I think, generally speaking, I think that this is not only possible but likely anywhere in the West, even with the West having a broad variety of different subcultures. I can't really speak to Asia because I know nothing at all about Asia, and Asia is a much different place with very different cultures, obviously. But I think that the chances of this happening in the West are very high. And you see this in part because of the attraction of things like Mormonism, or even the Amish. I mean, the Amish are exploding in America. I mean, people don't want what they have now. They want to have it both ways. They want to have all the total atomized freedom, but they don't want the worthlessness and total lack of meaning that comes along with that. And eventually people will adopt a new preference cascade in favor of presumably a new leader around which coalesces a new ruling class. And instead of people spitting on women who choose to have a lot of children, for example, women who have a lot of children will be, as they always were throughout history, highly honored. And these things can change overnight. It's a failure of vision. This is, as they say, people predict the continuation of the thing that is happening. What we have now is a dead end, and so by definition, it's going to change to something else. And the chances are very good that it'll change rapidly to something that's more that has happened in the past, the way people were in the past, because people aren't any different than they used to be. So yeah, I think this is all going to happen in the West, and probably pretty soon. Whether or not, I mean, you have various challenges, particularly so Southern Europe, for example, is faced with being entirely taken over by invaders. So I mean, it's a problem if you don't have any children and then other people take your country and kick you out. Or kill you. Well, then it's kind of hard to regain your country. But short of that, I think that the West is going to renew itself in some kind of way that will be different, but highly desirable.
Well, the people at the bottom of society, they tend to look up for the people at the top. They get inspired by them. And so, all in all, the kind of leadership and the kind of elites that we need to restore society to a natural order, to an organic order, has to be credentialized of some sort. They have to possess the prestige, and they have to possess the meanings to be able to go and speak to the people at the bottom and to say, I can guide you.
Well, traditionally, this was either religious or military figures, right? And military figures have kind of dropped off there's literally in America no military figure whom anybody respects in the least. I mean, I can't think of any at all. I mean, I certainly only have contempt for everybody I'm aware of in the military, and religious figures as well in certain circumstances. But obviously, religious figures that people look up to are also in pathetically short supply in the West, but that can change. And so I think you're right that what you need is a handful of people, or even just one person that people can look up to get the process started. And none of these things are overnight. We're not going to wake up on Saturday and everything's going to be just incredibly great. This is going to take decades, but it's at some point you have to get the party started, and that's what we should do.
Well, I am thinking, and I am talking about this because at least for younger people, there's this kind of choice that we have to make. Do we try to go to elite schools and serve the system, or do we try to make our own ways and become the leaders and the elites that our countries are needing right now? Because it's very difficult. You have people who are serving the system and who are definitely not fit to rule, but they are part of I call them the chaste, the casta, because they are the kind of people who are ruling, and they are the sons of the people who ruled before us, and so on and so forth. And then you have people who are trying to make their way, and they are not accepted in society because, oh no, you're not graduated from a top school, you're not working in a very good place, your family is part of the ancestral enemies, or I don't know, whatever. Well, I've seen a lot of examples of that.
I think that my opinion is that you probably have to the extent you have the talents, follow the traditional cursus honorum of going to a more prestigious school, at least if you have that set of talents. Though my younger children, I would probably actively discourage from going to college at this point. But I'll worry about that later because it's several years off. But I think that if you're following that, you're embedding yourself in the regime. In a sense, you're serving the regime. I think probably the most important thing is the participation in parallel structures, primarily, for lack of a better term, clubs, and you see this more and more in the States, particularly among men, the creation of a variety of, I generically call them secret societies, but they're not secret societies, they're not wholly secret, but where men interact with each other and they locate other people like them, particularly on a local basis. And I think that's very helpful to both keep your own faith alive, your faith in your anti-regime faith, even if you're serving the regime, and knowing when the time comes who your friends are, who you can rely on in order to help create the new regime. So I think as long as you are reaching out and attempting to form parallel structures of various kinds, and by parallel structures, I don't mean parallel governments, but I mean parallel groups of individuals who are getting ready to rule when the time comes. That's probably your best bet. I don't really counsel pacifism. That is, I think there's a bunch of people on the right who say, well, never contradict the government, only agree with the government, don't make yourself a target, kind of stuff. I think there's some truth to that. Depending on what your job may be, you may have to do that. But I think at the minimum, you should be participating actively in anti-government activities that are private. And of course, technology allows these things to be done much more privately than they used to. By anti-government activities, I don't mean you should be engaging in criminal activities, but rather in consorting with other people of like mind in preparation for the future.
Well, yeah, I think in history you have examples of that. We have the Freemasons, we have the secret societies of centuries past, and I mean, we have examples of that. But right now, we still have a lot of opportunities and a lot of options for the future, which I think that we haven't seen how to exploit yet.
I think that's right, and I think that technology is a mixed bag, but I think technology allows us to allows people to form these groups in a way that never used to be possible. And I think the idea that the government is going to unleash digital totalitarianism on us is stupid. I mean, the government can't control. I mean, the government is already at the outer limits of its capability of controlling the narrative, controlling the message with its regime media and so on. And it's basically a total failure because most of America thinks that the regime knows the regime is just lying to them, and they just assume that's true. There's just no way back from that. There's not. If they lie harder, it's not going to get better for them. And people just don't believe what the government has to say. There's just no digital totalitarianism is just not coming for us. There's not going to be a social credit system in America where people aren't allowed to eat because they said the wrong things on social media. I mean, that might work in China. It's not going to work here. I mean, it's like where I live. I mean, I don't even notice that the COVID is going on. I mean, nobody wears masks. Nobody cares. I mean, everybody does exactly as they please, and the government can't do anything about it. I mean, they just yap, and nobody cares.
Well, I wish that was in here as well. I mean, I try to go without my mask pretty much everywhere I go. The problem is that there are people who tell you you have to use your mask, and I know, why do I have to use my mask? I mean, everyone is already vaccinated here.
Yeah, I mean, but people. I mean, my point isn't that there's not some level of annoyance, but the government simply can't control. Digital technology simply does not allow the level of control that some people think it does. I mean, yeah, it does at some level. It may make it hard for you to express yourself on social media without losing your job, for example. But parallel structures and jobs and so on will arise to route around that, simply because there's so many people who are opposed to that. And since what the government has to offer is mostly fake jobs and fake GDP, weirdly, as this parallel economy increases in strength and power, it's much more real. So someday we'll all wake up and the people who are opposed to the government will be the only ones with real jobs and a real economy, and everyone else will be starving because their only job is teaching gender studies, and which is not a real job and doesn't have any social value whatsoever.
Well, actually, you're seeing something like that with the cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and so on. The people who are actually kind of trading in Bitcoin and so on, they're trying to keep a stable, a real job, so to speak, and producing value for others.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
there's also the whole NFT fiasco and anything like that. The people who are using Bitcoin, they're trying to keep it real. Well, the rest of the people who are getting paid in dollars, they are teaching gender studies and working for the government.
Right, they call it Fed bucks, as they call them in America. I mean, there's all fake money. I mean, everything in America and presumably in most of the Western world is fake. It's just fake. I mean, fake money, fake jobs, fake GDP. I mean, that's impossible to continue forever. And I think you're right that the people who are, whether it's crypto or whether it's alternative job structures of various kinds, these things all fit together to create organically a real set of society, a real economy. And that's very good news, because that could easily, when the fake economy vaporizes, then hopefully there'll be some structure that can pretty quickly take on the role of being in charge, and all the gender studies people can go pick, sugar beets or something.
Well, I hope. I'm a little bit worried because everyone at the elites right now, it's super indoctrinated with the gender stuff, and yeah, it's kind of annoying. But at least on my side, I have to play dumb and say no. Yeah, that's good. It's okay. It's not very honest for me, but it's the kind of survival strategy that at least the people like me have.
Right, but I mean, there's more people than like you, than most people think. I mean, the vast majority, even people who aren't post-liberal or on the right, most of them think much of what they're forced to do is stupid. I mean, the amount of people who believe in the stupidity that there's 83 genders or whatever the latest stupidity is, I mean, that's a very small group of people. And so as soon as we can shut their mouths and make them go pick sugar beets or whatever, we'll all be a lot better off.
Well, I think that's a wrap. We've been talking about an hour and a quarter.
Okay.
And yeah, actually we kind of make our interviews an hour long, because except when we have like more people, because they tend to talk a lot. And
that's fine. It's good length.
Well, very well. Thank you very much, Charlie. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Yes, indeed.
And that's it. I'm going to stop the stream.